Hey everyone, my name is Arun Venugopal. I am a reporter at WNYC and host of Micropolis. Thanks to all of you for joining us. It's 7 o'clock, so maybe a lot of you hear banging pans outside your apartments or outside mine. I know it's a moment for gathering and celebrating where things are and who's on the front lines. Today we're gonna have a conversation about who's on the front lines of food and eating and who's gonna keep that going, what the city's gonna look like. I wanna thank the MetLife Foundation for helping make this conversation possible and for bringing this conversation to your screens. I also wanna thank Eater New York for all the amazing work they've been doing these last few weeks, well, years, but especially now when everything is so up in the air. Thank you for all that reporting and research, and also thanks for joining us here tonight. We want to get a clearer picture of what exactly is going on with the food service industry, and also just find out what's in store for us. If you live in the 5 boroughs, kind of wondering what's going on, what the city's going to feel like, look like, taste like. I think hopefully this conversation will help set the table for that. So we're joined tonight by 3 people: Eater New York reporter Tanay Warerkar, Mohamed Attia, who is the executive director of the Street Vendor Project at the Urban Justice Center, and Nikoa Evans-Hendricks, executive director of Harlem Park and also owner of Ruby's Vintage Harlem. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we really get into the serious stuff, I want to ask each of you, I'll call on you just to make things easier, but I'm kind of curious what restaurant you're really kind of missing right now, restaurant or bar. So let's start with you, Tanay. Anything that you really kind of like are really missing out on right now?
Ooh, I'm thinking of this like South African place that is pretty close to where I live in East Harlem. It's called Kaya Wine Bar, and they make this amazing like meat pie that's called boboti. And yeah, I'm just remembering like the last meal I had there with my husband, and yeah, we were just enjoying some great wine and eating that pie. And yeah, I really miss that.
Okay, on the opposite side, is there anything you have been relying on? I know you're not right now in East Harlem. You're out in Connecticut right now. But is there anything you've been really either trying to support or just kind of like turning to these last few days?
Yeah, I mean, over here I like cycle through like an Indian, Thai, and Chinese takeout place, and we usually do like takeout once every 3 days. We have that kind of like set, and so yeah, I'm kind of like just rotating between those.
Okay, cool. All right. How about you, Nikoa? Anything that's that you're really missing out on these days?
Well, I do miss having my own restaurant open, Ruby's Vintage, and just really seeing all of the kind of loyal customers that we had coming through there and having that kind of social connection. But I've actually been making it a point to order delivery from many of the restaurants that are part of Harlem Park. So I've at least twice a week from my family. I take a break from cooking dinner. So I've been able to kind of have, fulfill all of my taste bud wishes in that way. So twice a week, 2 different restaurants, we've been ordering either for lunch or dinner and sort of making our rounds that way. It's not the same as going to the restaurants, but it's giving it a little bit of it at home. And so I'm encouraging everyone else to do that as well, because it makes a big difference.
So a shout out to any of those restaurants. I mean, I'm sure people would appreciate your curatorial taste here.
Well, it ranges. My daughter's huge favorite is Sylvia's. So at least once a week, I have to order. She's got a standing order at Sylvia's restaurant for her fried chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans. So that's like without question. Mommy is in trouble if I don't order that. But then we've also been ordering from The Grange, which is in West Harlem. They've a wonderful selection of entrees and great wines. I've actually been ordering wine from there as well. Nice. So I've ordered from Melba's and Field Trip. field trips, rice bowls have become like a staple. The salmon rice bowl at field trip and the seafood gumbo is amazing. So I have definitely, they hear my name there a lot, or they see it come up on the ticker tape that the orders come in from Nikoa.
You are a dependable customer. How about you, Mohamed? Where are you?
Well, I'm in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, but I would say that the most place I miss is really the food carts and food trucks out there. I used to go all the time next to my office in downtown by Broadway, and there are like a ton of food carts serving delicious platters, delicious meals that I really miss the most. I really miss Biryani House, serves the great biryani out of a cart. I do miss King of Falafel when I was in Midtown and Astoria, the nice truck and the nice car serving the best falafel in the city. I do miss those people so much.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky because literally a block from me, we have the Birria food truck, which makes this sensational sort of Mexican beef soup and a couple other things. Almost everything is beef on that menu. So if you don't eat beef, it may not be the best place. But even if you don't eat beef, you may kind of convert.
Wow.
When you go to the Birria truck, I'm serious. I'm like, I give it to my wife, and she's like, all right, okay. And she's like, wow, this is amazing. So that's an incredible resource for us now that they've kind of come back into service, and we're really thankful for that. So let's kind of get this going. I mean, Tanay, everybody's kind of wondering. They're worried. They're anxious about the city. Even if they're not in the food industry, they're really worried about what we can expect. So just kind of big picture, how bad is it?
So it's pretty bad. There's no two ways about that. I think, just like an overview for everyone. So the shutdown in New York City, at least, is through mid-June right now. And Governor Cuomo has slotted restaurants in what he calls phase 3 of the opening. And so if New York City was to open on June 13th, restaurants would only, potentially open at least a month after that, because they're kind of, they're doing the phases every 2 weeks. And restaurants are in phase 3. And we also don't know yet, New York hasn't issued any guidelines specific to restaurants yet. So we don't know what the reopening will look like, what sort of capacity restaurants will open at, whether it'll be half capacity, what kind of social distancing guidelines will be in place at restaurants. I would say from the restaurant owners that we've spoken to every day, I think the top issues that come up again and again are rent, because there hasn't been any kind of legislation tied specifically to rent. There's the Paycheck Protection Program, the federal loan, but that really only accounts for about 25% of the funds can be used for rent, and the rest has to go to to employees. And it's only over an 8-week period. So, a lot of owners are worried that that money is going to run out soon. And a lot of the employees will have to go back on unemployment once those funds run out, because, dining in as we knew it before is not going to come back anytime soon. And I would say, aside from rent, the other big concern, or at least I would say request, is concerns outdoor dining, because, we've heard these reports of the virus spreading more easily in enclosed spaces. And, NYC restaurants already have so little real estate to work with. So, what would, limited capacity reopening even look like, just like 2 or 3 tables for many restaurants. And so there is a plan right now. The mayor has started shutting down streets, and the New York Hospitality Alliance, which is a group that represents thousands of restaurants in the city, is in talks with the city council and the mayor's office to discuss ways of getting more, outdoor dining on closed streets. But again, nothing has been formalized yet.
So I'm going to turn this question to Nikoa. I want to hear your answer first, though. Like, why is takeout not doing a good job of sort of substituting for a physical reopening right now, from your perspective, Tanay?
Sure. Well, I mean, the reality is that a lot of the reason that we go out, and especially when you're in cities like New York, where you live in small spaces, we are going to a lot of these venues, not just for the food, because, you know, the food is great in a lot of places, but it's the experience that you have in the venue. And so it's that social interaction, just great conversation, the ambiance, the vibe. There's a lot of different ways people describe it, but that is probably more of the experience or what people desire than the food itself. And so when you have the takeout, obviously the food is great, but you're missing all of those other elements in terms of the entertainment. It is really a big part of entertainment and nightlife in New York City, to go out to eat, to go out for a drink, to hang out at a bar. People have formed friendships that they're the friends that are at that bar. You know, they have entire social lives that revolve around the experiences they have at particular venues, especially when you get in neighborhoods like Harlem or different neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens. People, that neighborhood feel, you know, the owner, you've been going there for years, you've been bringing your kids there. I mean, there's a lot of history sometimes in these venues. So getting takeout in a bag just doesn't really encapsulate all of that. And so as best as you can, you know, we're delivering on the quality that people had grown accustomed to in the restaurants, but you just can't beat that actual dine-in experience that we're all longing to get back to.
So, Nikoa, Tanay kind of laid out the basics of what's been going on from sort of the rollout, if you will, from the state. As a restaurateur yourself, how satisfied are you with how things have been going from the policy perspective?
Well, I will say that, you know, what's most important when you're developing these kind of policies, and which it's often lacking, is the perspective of the actual business owners that are going to be required to implement and that actually have the expertise in the field. And so I think with some of the initial thinking around everything from the funding programs to other resources to the actual policies that we're looking at, there wasn't a whole lot of input provided from the merchant side, from the business owner side, so that it missed the mark on what is truly needed. I think that there's been a sort of a recognition of that omission. And so I'm pleased to see, particularly with a lot of the lobbying efforts of the New York City Hospitality Alliance, Andrew Rigi, as you mentioned, there are a lot of things that have been changed or proposed for change as a result of that. Everything from the design of the PPP program, the window of time for payback, the possibility of looking at rent discussions with landlords, the window of time that someone can decide whether they're going to stay or hand back their keys. There are a lot of things that have been pushed forward that are being considered and it seems likely will be approved, that will make it a little bit easier for this recovery period. It was pretty egregious in the beginning, and for a lot of us, a lot of entrepreneurs, it felt very hopeless. Like there's just no way we can recover with the prohibitive climate that was being created for us. You were asking for a miracle. You know, New York City, the dining and nightlife is a part of the fabric of New York City. It's part of the experience. So without taking into account the recovery and the reopening of this industry in New York City and cities like New York City, without the perspective of the operators who really understand the nuts and bolts of how this works and what needs to be done. With some guidelines from the Department of Health and some other things. Clearly, the virus is something that we have to take very seriously, and there are new protocols that have to be put in place. But it's going to be important that there's sort of a collaboration so that we can take into account what we as the operators have to contend with, because ultimately, we are the ones that either make it or break it. Like, we survive this or we lose everything as a result. And for most people, small business owners, this is our livelihood. It's every dollar of our savings, of our mom, dad, friends, family, monies that have been put in. It's really, everything is on the line for us. And so this is, for us, absolutely critical that we get it right, recognizing that we're dealing with a completely unprecedented experience here. And that's just the reality is. And because of that, you need as many brains in the think tank as possible trying to solve this problem.
So do you have an approximate date in your head that you think, okay, I think we're going to reopen around then?
Well, I mean, okay, so as was just mentioned, the rollout, the planned reopening is mid-July. That really depends, honestly, on what the guidelines are around that. I've heard everything from 25% capacity to 50% capacity is what the restrictions are going to be. I know that there are a lot of restaurants that are going to say, there's no way you can make this business work at 25 to 50%. I have 100% of my bills. I can't pay that on 50% capacity. And they may decide to walk away from it. So it's really going to depend on where things end up in terms of the stipulations that are put in place for us. And then also the support. This won't work at all if we really don't have the support of the landlords who recognize that there's going to have to be some give here. Just quite simply, unless you want to see blocks and blocks of vacant spaces with people who cannot, new businesses that can't go in and take over those spaces, this is true partnership here, from the landlord to the tenant, to the city, to the consumer. Like, we are all going to be working together, trying to rebuild. And without that mindset, it can't be an us or them, like it typically is with the landlord-tenant relationship or the city and it's all of us together trying to organically recover from something that blindsided all of us and has created new scenarios that we've never dealt with before.
Mohamed Attia, you're the executive director of the Street Vendors Project. What's going on with street vendors? You're probably in conversation with them constantly right now, right?
Yeah, we are. And I mean, what's going on with the vending scene, as you all have seen lately, you go out in the street and you don't see any vendors, even in these neighborhoods where you know that tons of vendors are here every day, and you wonder what's going on, where everyone at. So like in the past 8 weeks or so, we estimate that about 90% of street vendors have stopped operating completely because of the lack of foot traffic, the lack of business. Although by nature, you would think that food vendors are takeout already. So what has changed? Not much, right? You're not going to find a bunch of customers like putting out seats around a food cart or a food truck and just dine in the sidewalk. That doesn't really happen. But what's happening in the real life, that in many neighborhoods where street vendors rely on the foot traffic, rely on the employees and workers in their neighborhoods, rely on the office buildings that is usually full by thousands of employees who are potential customers to their cars and trucks. Other vendors who work in touristic places like Times Square, downtown, all these people rely 100% on foot traffic. They don't have the regular customer who will call and order the food and stop by the cart or the truck and pick it up. And that's why a lot of people have stopped working completely. Now, for these 10 or so percent of these vendors who are still operating, they work in residential areas where they have the regular customers who will come to them and buy their products and their food. We have a lot of fresh produce vendors who are out there all across the city. Like, you'll see them in Manhattan and Queens and parts in Brooklyn and Bronx, all across the 5 boroughs, because their business is still okay. It is not as before. They got a lot of reduction in their daily sales. People have been reporting like 50% loss, an 80% loss, but within that 20 or 50% of business, they are able to sustain the business. They are able to cover the expenses and maybe make very, very little profit, which is better than nothing. Because when we look at street vendors, they don't really qualify to any support from the government. All the government programs, all the small business services, grants and loans, they don't qualify to any.
Because we're talking about, everybody okay?
Yep, we're here.
Yeah.
I heard somebody like having some sort of horrible explosive digestive issue. We'll move on. Mohamed, are you saying that you're not qualifying because of the category or because of, say, immigration status or what?
Well, so it's a couple of things. Like for those people who are documented, who have immigration status in the country, when they get to apply to these grants and loans, they have a lot of requirements that they need to provide. And street vendors don't have that fancy, complicated documentations to provide to qualify for all these programs. And here's the complicated part. Like most street vendors, perhaps all, but I would say most, to be accurate, are sole proprietors for their businesses. They are the only worker in the business. They are the only owner of the business. They don't have a payroll. They don't have a W-2 for the workers. They don't have all that structure. Most of them don't use business bank accounts. Most of them don't use all these requirements that the government will ask for. And of course, it's like a hassle to apply for the grant and apply for the loan. And at the very end, you just get this email, sorry, you're not qualified, you're not eligible. So when we look at how the system is created, we find that it's very exclusive. Of course, another layer you can talk about here is the lack of language access. All these applications on the websites are in English, and like our communities are immigrants. They speak different languages. English is not their prime language. It's not their first language. So it gets to be really challenging for them to access these grants. And of course, we try our best to support our community and support our members by applying, and we will walk them through the application, but we know that most of them won't even qualify. So why in the first place? So on the other hand, we're supporting whomever will be eligible to the PUA. For those people who are workers, who are self-employed, who are staying home now, they don't have any income, we are helping them to apply, and yet we haven't heard that anyone received the unemployment benefit from the government. That's another layer. Now, if you want to talk about the undocumented vendors, forget about it. That's a whole other story. We all know that undocumented immigrants in this country didn't receive a dime from the government. They didn't receive a penny. They didn't receive anything. And now people have absolutely no income. And of course, for a micro business owner, you can imagine that a business owner who work in the street out of a shopping cart, out of a tiny cart, running very small business, don't have a lot of savings, don't have a lot of like safety net to rely on, don't have a lot of resources to support them during such a crisis. Without any income in like a period of 2 months, where do you think this person is getting money from? How are they gonna survive? People haven't paid rent, they haven't paid bills, they haven't spent any money on anything but what's very, very essential. And in the past couple of weeks, we have been talking to people who said literally they ran out of money. And they ran out of people, friends and family that they can borrow money from. And they don't have credit cards, they don't have anything to rely on. So people literally have nothing. Like I spoke to people last week who said, we don't have $1 in the bank account. The bank account is minus. People said, we don't have $10 in the house and we don't know how we're gonna make it happen to the end of the week. So where is the city in all of this? When we talk about New York City, when we talk about the progressive government, when we talk about the sanctuary city that welcome immigrants, where is the city in all of this? Where is New York State? Where is the governor? And we have been asking the governor, along with many other organizations who represent undocumented immigrants, workers across the state, and we're asking the governor and the mayor to step up and do something about the situation, provide a recovery program, a relief program that will support everyone across the board, not only people with immigration status.
So we're going to get to those questions in a second. Right now, in case you've joined us just in the last few minutes, I'm Arun Venugopal. I'm speaking with Mohamed Attia, who's just speaking. He's Executive Director of the Street Vendor Project at the Urban Justice Center. I'm also speaking with Nikoa Evans-Hendricks. She is the Executive Director of Harlem Park and owner of Ruby's Vintage Harlem, as well as Tanay, what's your last name? Warerkar, who is at Eater, New York, and who's been covering this topic of restaurants, the food industry, and restaurant industry in general, and where that's going right now for Eater, New York. In addition to that, I just want to say, if you do appreciate live journalism and you want to be able to keep us, help us bring you more of these kinds of conversations, please do consider donating to support us at New York Public Radio if you aren't in a position to do that right now. We accept donations from our members, and those donations go a long way in helping support this kind of work. We sincerely appreciate anything you can offer right now. If you do want to donate, we've made it really easy. You can just text LIVE live to 70101 70101. You can make a pledge like that, and you can keep programs like this going. It's on your screen right now. So just do a quick text, fill out when the show's done. Thank you so much for doing that, and for all your support. We really do appreciate it. So let's get back into this conversation. Tanay, Mohamed made a pretty, I guess, bold sort of like demand, like what is the city and what is the state doing right now from your perspective?
So I would say New York has generally been slower than other parts of the country, especially, other big cities. Particularly, I'm thinking of California right now in implementing any kind of policies. And the city council only very recently, just last week, passed a bunch of legislation to, help restaurants out. But again, they didn't go they didn't go as far as they had initially proposed. So one example was, restaurant owners will often tell us about the fees that they have to pay third-party delivery apps right now, and they go up to as much as 30% an order, which is really crazy right now, considering restaurants are barely making any money. And so initially, the council had proposed a 10% cap. Now that's gone up to 20, in the sense that if you're not using third-party apps for delivery, but you're just using them for customers to place orders, it's a 5% cap. But then if they are using delivery, then it's an additional 15% fee as well. So it ends up being a 20% cap, which is less than some of the other cities, like San Francisco has a 15% cap, for instance. Some of the other measures they introduced included waiving sidewalk license fees for outdoor seating, which usually end up costing restaurants thousands of dollars a year. And so that's been suspended through February 28th next year. Another issue that we heard from restaurant owners was about the personal liability clause in some leases. So, if a business fails or if an owner walks away, then, the landlord could go after the owner's personal assets. So that's also kind of been paused temporarily. But, some of the other measures, like I mentioned earlier, rent, which is really on the top of mind for a lot of owners. The city council had proposed a measure. So just to backtrack for a second, there's currently a moratorium on evictions for residential and commercial tenants. So that includes restaurants. Initially, that was going through the end of June. And recently, Governor Cuomo extended that to August 20th. So if a restaurant doesn't pay rent right now, for instance, they won't be evicted. But it doesn't mean that, say on August 21st, they won't have to pay all the rent that they owe, from months before. And from all the owners that we've spoken to, almost no one has been able to cover full rent. Some restaurant owners are making agreements with landlords to pay a percentage of the income that they're bringing in. Some restaurant owners have received deferrals, but again, this doesn't mean that they don't have to pay that rent eventually. Some landlords may expect them to pay over 6 months, over a year, but with no idea of when things are going to go back to normal. A lot of the owners are still on the hook to make these, massive payments later this year. So in that sense, I would say, we're still lacking, the cities and the state is still lacking in terms on that front.
One of the more interesting things that you and I have discussed in terms of trying to figure out some sort of a safer way of reopening are what you refer to as sort of closing down certain streets just for dining purposes. Can you tell us a little more about that and where things stand on that front?
Yeah, so right now the discussions, so the mayor has already closed down several streets in the city, to traffic. And so it's only open to pedestrians, and it's meant to encourage more social distancing, especially, in the warmer weathers, people go out more. And, I'm sure all of you have seen there's more people out on the streets now, especially over the past couple of weekends. So the idea is to kind of gradually phase in more of these closed streets. So, you may have seen some places, outdoor dining is pretty common in Europe. Lithuania recently did it, closing down, most of the city for outdoor dining to closer to traffic, that is. And so, the thought is kind of similar in that sense. One street, Stone Street in Fidei, has been mentioned as an example of, things that the city could do. But again, discussions are very much in the early stages. So we haven't, both from the city's perspective or from the Hospitality Alliance, which I mentioned earlier, or even, business improvement districts that the city is talking to and the city council is talking to as well. We haven't really heard of, places that they have identified yet, but it's definitely something that's being seriously discussed. And I think a lot of owners are hoping for that to happen as well.
Nikoa, is that something that does speak to you and your interests?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a start. The outdoor seating capacity is going to be the sort of the saving grace, for restaurants. Tanay had mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of space inside many of the venues. You're lucky if you have a large restaurant, you're a bigger restaurant group and you have a large space. So for that model to work, we were packing them in. Now that we won't be able to do that, we are going to depend heavily on outdoor space to make up for that. And so the closed streets will help expand what we have to work with. So it's critical, actually, to a fighting chance for this to work. And I love that there's already some interesting discussions around design strategies for open seating that different architects are taking a look at and creating templates that hopefully restaurants will be able to quickly implement, and we can, salvage the summer. If we are allowed to open in July, we can at least get in, 2 or 3 months where we're able to really implement some of these things. But because the dialogue is still happening, time is of the essence. So, the quicker the decision is made, the quicker we can, as operators, start to make the investments needed to execute it.
And Nikoa, when Tanay was referring to New York as kind of lagging on the policy front compared to, say, California, from your perspective, does that feel right? We think of this city as being so dependent on its restaurants and its eateries and bars. But is what he's saying, does that ring true for you? That you're being kind of sort of like not being taken as seriously as you need to be?
I think that rings true for all of us. People, the state obviously understands how much the dining scene in New York, the hospitality industry, is one of the main industries. It's the biggest, reason for drives our tourism. It's a lot of the reason why people live in New York City and visit. So it is there does seem to be a disconnect between the focus on the industry as one of the biggest and most important industries in the city, economically, in terms of the economic development of the city, and the kind of push and measures being put in place and protections for that industry. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, it feels like they're catching up to themselves. And it's been because of the outcry. I mean, the industry, the lobbying on behalf of the industry is the reason why they had to, stand up and take notice. And so that, thankfully, here in New York City, we are organized, right? We're organized within our neighborhoods and we're organized within our industry so that very quickly that call to action could be put in place and it could be taken up the proper channels to put them on notice. And so that there was a reckoning, if you will. And so we're starting to see some of that response that we wanted, but there's a lot more that needs to be discussed and put in place. So it's not as progressive on the onset as we would have liked, but it's gaining speed. I'll put it that way. It's gaining speed. So hopefully prior to our actually opening and having to try to, because the thing about it is when we do get the chance to open, we have to hit the ground running. I mean, it's like, it's got to be figured out and we've got to know exactly what we have to do and what the protocols are and have all of the information in place in terms of what our risk and liability. We've got to know that day one, not 60 days in, because you just have to go hard at it and see where you are at the end of the year. And that's really a limited amount of time for business owners to really be able to make the decision. Because a lot of people by the end of the year, come January, there's going to be a lot of decisions made. People are going to have decided, I gave it the good old college try and it doesn't work, or it looks promising and I'm going to stick it out. But you already see businesses folding. Some businesses that are institutions have been around for decades, have hung up their keys. So after a few months of this, others are going to make that decision if they don't see the promise, because it's a huge risk. The restaurant business is tough. And the liabilities that again, these are small business owners, individuals who put their entire life savings. This can affect you financially for the next decade if you walk away from this with that liability on your back. And so, especially when it is through no fault of your own, a catastrophe that's happened. You didn't run your business into the ground, something, a catastrophe happened. And so you had to deal with the consequences of that. And so the broader window that we can have to make the assessment by the first of the year as to whether this is going to work or it's not going to work is imperative.
Mohamed, we've been talking about adaptations that may be in the works when it comes to restaurants. Is there anything similar being proposed for vendors?
Well, so we have proposed a number of ideas that will support street vendors during this crisis and the next phase of the reopening and how things will look like after this crisis. And it all started with the whole vending system. The whole vending system is broken. And when you get to food vending, it is super broken that perhaps not a lot of people are aware of that. There is like an underground market for the food vending permits that food vendors deal with. So people cannot access permits from the city. They cannot apply for a permit from the city to work in a legal way. So what they do, they rent a permit from someone who was lucky enough to have a permit at some point and pay them up to $25,000 to rent their permit for only 2 years. And every 2 years, they have to go to this person again and pay them more money. So this is the system that vendors are dealing with before COVID-19, before this crisis. And of course, it still stands the same way. I've talked to people like in the beginning of March and beginning of this crisis who just renewed their permit and paid that $25,000 a week before they had to shut down. You can imagine how devastating this situation is, right? You've been saving for 2 whole years to pay that person to stay in business, and next week you're home, your car's in the garage, you cannot go out to work. This is the whole system. Also, many other vendors cannot afford to deal with this, cannot afford to pay the 25K every couple of years, so they operate without a permit. Although they have a food vendor license, they have a sales tax ID, they pay taxes just like any other businesses, but they cannot obtain a permit from the city and they cannot afford to deal with this market. So what they do, they sell without a permit and take the risk. And this is very, very risky. You can imagine these vendors can get arrested anytime. They can get $1,000 ticket and they can get their stuff confiscated by the NYPD or Department of Health. Now, what we are seeing, how these people will survive, how these people will go out to work and make ends meet, how these people will put food on their tables. And we have seen that many of them have stopped working. And in the past week or so, some of them just gave up of staying home and they went out, regardless what the situation is, regardless how empty the streets are. And they are trying to make a buck because they literally have nothing. And what was the reaction from the city? Yesterday, as we're speaking, just yesterday, we heard that NYPD have been ticketing vendors on Corona Plaza in Corona, Queens. This is ridiculous. This is not the time to be like really aggressive about enforcement. This is not the time to go give somebody $1,000 ticket and give them a criminal ticket, send them to criminal court because they don't have any money in their homes and they don't have any way to support themselves. And the city's not doing anything. So, I mean, what are you expecting these vendors to do? If you're not offering absolutely nothing, you're not offering any support, at least let them do their thing. They are not hurting anyone. They are following all the health and like safety regulations and rules. They are keeping all their food and all their carts clean. They are following all the rules except for having that piece of paper stick on their cards. That piece of paper the city has that the city is not issuing anymore. So this is the system now, and we're thinking next, what about these open streets? What about these public spaces that people will go out and hang out and they want to spend some time in the public space? So why the city doesn't create designated spaces for vendors? So vendors can operate or run their business there in a legal way without the red tape, without having to deal with the NYPD. Just like we see like every weekend, ideally in the normal life, we see every weekend in the street markets, the street fairs all across the city. We see people operating in a legal way. There is one permit for this whole market without this underground market, without paying $25,000 to someone. And we've seen a lot of vendors going there, selling different products and selling different foods and attract a lot of foot traffic to the neighborhood. And we have seen this model is very successful. And it's the basic thing to offer to street vendors at the moment. Also, we have been talking and people and the legislative side about the legislation that's been stalled in the city council. There is a legislation that will increase the number of food vending permits by 400 new permits every year that has been there in the city council for about 6 years now. And we haven't seen any progress in the city council since the hearing last year. So far, the legislation has 30 co-sponsors, 29 council members on it, the public advocate is on it, and the speaker hasn't called a vote yet. So when this legislation will pass, so we give relief to those small businesses to pursue their American dream and make a better living in our city.
So we're gonna wrap it up real soon, but I don't want to end on a downer note. There's so many reasons we can be worried and have good reasons to be worried these days. But I think also, given that we are kind of looking at a reset, I want to ask first Tanay, and then I want to end on Nikoa. This question of like, is there an upside that you see at this moment where we're rethinking it? Tanay, is there something that you see as possible that you've never imagined possible before this moment when it comes to dining out in New York City?
So, I can't speak to, what might happen exactly in the future, but I will say that from the last few weeks, we've been seeing that more restaurants have definitely felt more emboldened to reopen, places that had initially been closed, after the shutdown order went in March. But many more places are opening up again now for delivery and takeout. More small businesses have started receiving their federal loans, and that's part of the reason, some places have decided to reopen. Others are feeling encouraged by the fact that, they're seeing more restaurants reopen for takeout and delivery. So, they're also doing the same. And I think, one of the big ways that we can support restaurants right now is, like, before you go on to, your delivery app, like, try calling the restaurant first, or try going on their website first and seeing if you can order from there directly. It'll definitely happen in a few cases where you'll call the restaurant and they'll say, you can't place an order on the phone. Can you just go through the delivery app? But that's a really great way of bringing money to restaurants without them having to pay fees. And of course, like, lots of places are selling merchandise as well. So go buy shirts and mugs from your favorite places in the city. And tons of restaurants have set up employee relief funds as well. So if you have a few dollars to spare, definitely think about contributing to the employee relief funds.
Nikoa, I want to give you the last word. Is this the moment where you think, who knows, maybe there will be some good things that emerge from all of this?
I absolutely do. What I have found most interesting as I've been kind of following, I've been reading lots of articles and webinars, et cetera, and just seeing that this moment in which everyone has been required to sit still for a minute, and there's been a lot of self-reflection, it seems as though just consumers in general have been reassessing values and what's important to them. And I am excited, if there is a silver lining in this, is that maybe there'll be more alignment between sort of how we operate our businesses and just kind of the demands on us in the workplace, and aligning that with actually what is really, really important. This virus, if it's taught us anything, is how quickly things can change and affect us in a very real way, sort of mortality. So I think the upside of this is that when you look at, particularly with the restaurants as an example, we provide food, right? Food for communities, but there's a lot of communities within the neighborhoods that don't actually get to have our food. They cannot patronize our restaurants. Now, a lot of restaurants have become community kitchens, as an example, as a result of this, right? And they're providing meals that they're feeding to different, whether it's the frontline workers or it's seniors in assisted living or it's school children. But there's been this really great movement to feed the community. And I know that I've talked to a lot of different restaurant operators, Ruby's Vintage included. Field Trip, Chef JJ Johnson was really great at kind of starting the movement for us here in Harlem. They're going to continue to have that be a part of their mission of their restaurant, even once things get back to somewhat normal operations. So to me, that's an example of reimagining what does commerce look like? Can there be sort of a social impact focus that's kind of embedded into all of our business strategies, the way we operate, the way we think about what our contribution commerce-wise in the community. And so I think this reset, again, the people behind the businesses, people see brick and mortar, those are people that run those businesses. And those very people have been impacted by this in the same way everyone else has been. They've got family members that have been affected by it. They've had their children at home. We've all been affected by this personally. And so I think everyone is re-envisioning what this new normal could be, and can we get it right this time? There was a lot that could use some work, but because the machine was already kind of churning, you couldn't really see how to shift. Now it's all been set at zero. We are literally rebuilding almost from nothing. So there are a lot of things that we wished we could have done. And if I could do this over again, and if I'd known what I knew now, if I knew what I knew then, what I know now, when I opened my business, I would have done this. This is the opportunity to do all of that. And so I think part of the silver lining is the fact that we just as a community, whether you're a business owner, you're a resident in the community, all of the different partners in this society that we live in, all get the opportunity to kind of imagine the ideal and then see how close we can get to it with this new discovery of what's really, really important at the end of the day. And it really comes down to humanity, right? It's people coming together and wanting to be a community and serve each other and for the better good. And it may sound a little corny, but I think I keep hearing that more and more. Like people are being given the opportunity to sit still and just be without the grind of just the go, especially in New York City, where you feel that pressure to just go. And if you're not doing 10 things, then you're just not a real New Yorker. And there's just all of that. Now it's like, well, actually the world does not fall apart if I do not run on full steam, with all my wheels turning. And so if that's the case, how much better do I feel? How much more do I want when I start my day? I think a lot of that is part of what's happening. And I think that will translate into businesses, and businesses are going to have to be mindful as they develop their own strategies. Be very, very in tune with where consumers are now, because the customer you had 2 months ago is a very, very different person. They've been through a lot. They have different expectations. What's important to them is different. So you're going to have to adjust by being in touch. And then consumers need to also recognize the business owners. We're people and we are adjusting in the same way that you are. So all of these things that we're trying to incorporate and integrate into our businesses, there's going to need to be a little bit of a transition given to us as well. This is a huge pivot for the entire world.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the word that really stays with me from everything you just said is humanity. I hope this is sort of going to shift the paradigm, certainly when we recognize the humanity of people that we know are not just, the dregs of our society. They are our frontline workers. They are they're keeping us fed. They are delivering the food to us. They are the delivery workers who are keeping you safe inside your home and shouldn't be demonized for taking his e-bikes to get that food to you, and ownerlessly, fined for those things that we now realize are really important, and they are the very heart of our society. Thank you for injecting that word into our consciousness as we go forward. I'm going to leave it there right now. Thank you so much to all three of you, to Mohamed Attia, the Executive Director of the Street Vendor Project, to Nikoa Evans-Hendricks, Executive Director of Harlem Park to Park and owner of Ruby's Vintage Harlem, and to Tanay Warerkar of Eater New York. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight, watch here and to be part of this conversation and hopefully take it forward, whether it's online or with your elected officials. My name is Arun Venugopal. If you like the show, you can like us and subscribe to our channel, and you can sign up for the Green Space newsletter at thegreenspace.org. Good night, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.